Hello coders, and thanks for joining us for another C# fundamentals tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about classes and objects, which is a continuation from the previous tutorial where we talked about object-oriented programming. Now what I want to do is start by defining what I want this program to be doing. Okay, so since we're getting into the production of our own classes, the structure of our code is going to become increasingly more important. Okay, so what I want to do is first describe to myself what I want this class to be doing, and it's going to help me organize my code a little bit better. So what I'm going to be saying is something like, and we're going to be using the previous example from our last tutorial. We're going to be creating an enemy class. Okay, so what I want is I'm going to create a description for myself. I want an enemy which can keep track of his own health, damage, name, and attack speed. And I want him to be able to attack. Okay, so this is just me assuming that I have no idea what I want to do yet. And so I'm going to write this description that tells me that reminds me exactly the type of program that I want to have. And so what you do when you create these descriptions is you look for all the nouns, and these nouns are typically going to be your classes. So nouns equal classes. Okay. The next thing you do is you look for various descriptors. So health, damage, name, attack speed. These are going to be your descriptors. And so your descriptors are going to be your variables, and actually your properties as well if you want them to be. And so the next thing you do is you look for your verbs as they relate to your noun. Okay, so I want him to be able to attack, and attack is going to be my verb. And so your verbs are going to be equal to your methods. Okay, and so now I have a clear understanding of how I want to organize and create my class. So there's two ways that we can create a class. What I can do is come down here in program.cs, and I can say class enemy and use my curly braces, and inside my curly braces is what's going to encapsulate what my enemy class contains and what it can do. And so as we talked about in the previous tutorial, my enemy is going to have, or my class is going to have, variables, properties, which we haven't talked about yet, and methods. Okay. Now, the problem with this methodology of creating your classes within your program.cs file is that it's quickly going to become unorganized and very difficult to read, especially to people who are viewing your code. And so this obviously isn't what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be creating our own C# file and organize it in the hierarchical structure of our Solution Explorer. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this for now. And what I want to do is, if you're using Visual Studio, come up to your project name, right-click, go to Add, New Item. Be sure that you're selected on the C# items, since we're using C#, and come over here on the right and select Class. Okay, and then you come down to name your class, and the name of our class is going to be Enemy. I'm going to Add, and as you can see, Microsoft Visual Studio automatically fills in some code for you. It automatically imports your using statements. It adds your class to the namespace of your project, and it initializes your class here called enemy. Okay, and you can also look over here in your hierarchy and see that enemy.cs has been created for you. Okay, now let's define what this enemy class is going to have. I'm going to keep reiterating this until it sticks in your guys' heads. So we're going to have variables, properties, and methods. And now one thing I didn't talk about, because it sort of falls into the method category, is constructors. Okay, every class is going to have constructors. It has to have a constructor. And we have two types of constructors. We have default constructor, and there can only be one of your default constructors. And then we have overloaded constructors. And we can have as many as we want of these. Okay, we're going to come back to these constructor topics in a minute. First, we want to start defining our variables. Okay, so our variable, if we look back to our description, our variable is going to have health, damage, name, and attack speed. These are the defining attributes of our enemy class. Okay, and so again, we have int health, and good practice whenever you're declaring your variables, go ahead and initialize them as well. So you want to start them off with an initial value. It's just good practice. So we have an int health, we have an int damage. Let me give these legitimate values. So 100 health, 5 damage, and then I want to have an attack speed. And to store my attack speed, I want to use a double. And I want to say that this enemy can attack every 1 second. Okay. Now I'm going to use another variable here that's going to support attack speed. It's going to be double as well. And what it is it's going to be my attack timer. And what this value is meant for is it's going to, every cycle that the attack method is called, it's going to increment attack timer by a small value until it reaches attack speed. And when it reaches attack speed, we're going to actually make the enemy attack. Okay, and I think we also have a name variable. So name is going to be a string type, and we're going to initialize this to, let's say, Cave Yeti. Okay, so this enemy by default is going to be a Cave Yeti. All right, I think that's going to cover our variables. Let's jump down to our methods. Now we only have one method for this class, and it's going to be attack. Okay, so it's not going to return anything, so we can make it void. And then we're going to have attack. Inside the curly braces is going to be the logic for our attack method. Okay, now as I said before, in the attack method, we want to be incrementing attack timer until it reaches attack speed, and whenever it reaches attack speed, we can attack finally. And so I found this value, which is equal to 0. And then 7 zeros, 1 5. Okay, and what I need to do is actually increment attack timer. So plus equals 0.00000015. And this is just a value that I came up with that is going to allow me to approximate 1 second fairly closely. Okay, again, this is just a rough approximation of what 1 second might be. Okay, and then what I want to say is, as I'm incrementing attack timer, I want to check if attack timer is greater than or equal to attack speed. Okay, so this value is going up and up and up and up from 0. Once it's finally equal to 1, I want to finally attack. And to simulate an attack, I'm just going to console.writeLine, and I'm going to use the name of our enemy. So let's see, name, use the concatenation operator, hit you for, so this is going to be Cave Yeti hit you for, and then I'm going to use concatenation for my damage, points of damage. Okay, so what this is going to say is Cave Yeti hit you for 5 points of damage. And so there's one more thing that I need to do to complete this method. I attack once, and my attack timer needs to be reset. So I'm going to say attack timer equals 0. And the reason this needs to be reset is because if it isn't, then after attack timer is equal to attack speed, it's going to continue increasing, and so it'll always be greater than attack speed. So this value is always going to be called for every cycle. Instead, if I set attack timer equal to 0 every time I attack, then I'm going to have to increment up to attack speed every time again. So this should simulate 1 second attack speeds. So every second we should see this this console.writeLine. Okay, so we have our variables and we have our methods. And again, I'm going to talk about properties in another tutorial. But now we need to get into our constructors. So what is a constructor? Well, as I said before in the previous tutorial, we have a class to object relationship, and a class can define multiple objects. It can spawn multiple objects, And whenever a class spawns an object, it's going to have to allocate new memory for that data. And so whenever we go to create our enemy, it's going to be done by accessing the enemy's constructor. So let's start by saying it's public. We're going to say enemy and use parentheses similar to a method. Okay, and so with constructors we don't need, so I'm going to type this out for you guys. With constructors we do not need return types. In fact, we just don't use return types. Okay, so it's not that we don't need them, we just don't use them. Okay, and the reason is because we're just not going to be returning anything. This is going to be class initialization. Let's see if I can spell this. Code. This is class initialization code. Okay, and so basically our constructors are going to be the first thing that our class runs. So constructors are the first thing the class runs. And so whenever we create a new enemy, this is going to be called, and after this is called, we are able to use our new enemy. Okay, so we have this is going to be our default constructor, okay, and then we have our overloaded constructor. So our default constructor isn't going to do anything. However, we can have overloaded constructors, and our overloaded constructors can essentially accept arguments. So they can accept parameters. And what I want to do for this overloaded constructor is accept a custom name, a custom health, and a custom damage. So I'm going to say string custom name, int custom damage, and int custom, I'll do health first actually, health, and int custom damage. Okay, and so this is, again, this is our initialization code. So class initialization code. And we can only call one constructor per object. So we can only call one constructor per object. All right, and so whenever we go to create a new enemy, we're going to choose from one of these constructors to instantiate our enemy with. And inside this inside this overloaded constructor, I want to initialize these values for name, health, and damage. And so what I'm going to be using is these variables up here. Now recall in a previous tutorial I briefly talked about variable scope. These variables here have scope only within this constructor. However, these variables up here have scope within the entire class. And as you can see, I'm using name, I'm using damage down here inside this method of my class. And so what I need to be doing is I need to be setting these variables by using these variables. So to show this, I'll just say name equals custom name. Okay? And the reason is, again, because I want to use name in other parts of my class. And I can't use custom name in any other part of my class because that scope is local to this constructor. Okay, so it doesn't exist out of this constructor. However, name does. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in the rest of this. Health equals custom health. And damage equals custom damage. Alright, so we have our default constructor that's ready to go. And we have our overloaded constructor that's ready to go. I believe our method is done and our variables are done. Okay, actually our method isn't done because I want to show you guys something. Okay, so let's come over to our program.cs file. And what we're going to do is basically declare a new enemy. Now what I want to do is, to illustrate how this is going to work, I'm going to create int variable name equal to 0. I'm going to create an integer, I'm going to create a variable name of type integer and set that equal to 0. Okay, and the reason I'm doing this is so I can show the similarities between creating or instantiating new objects of a class. Okay, so what I'm going to do is start by finding my class name, which is enemy, and this is my data type. Enemy is my data type, just like int is my data type. And so what's going to be the next thing that we do? Well, it's going to be defining our variable name. And so what do I want to call this enemy? I'm going to call this enemy Caveati. And so the next thing I do is I set it to an initial value. Okay, so the way I do that with my objects is I'm going to say enemy Caveati equals new. So I use C#'s keyword new, and then I'm going to find my constructor. So this part is where my constructors come. So enemy, and if I just use one parenthesis, you can see I have this one of two, and that's because I have two constructors. So my first constructor takes no parameters. My second constructor takes 3 parameters. Okay, and I can choose either one that I want, but I can't choose both. So for now, I'm just going to use my default constructor by not passing any parameters to it. Okay, so again, enemy is my data type, just like int is my data type. Caveati is my variable name, just like variable name is my integer variable name. And then this is my initialization. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this line of code. And what I'm going to do is actually write this out. So class name, variable name, or I'll say this is the object name since we are creating a new object. And then new constructor. Okay, so this is how it's going to be laid out whenever you're initializing new objects or instantiating new objects. Okay, so I have a Caveati, and what I want to do is I want my Caveati to attack within this loop while running, so that it's updating every cycle that the program runs. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to access my attack method. Now the way we do this is the dot operator. Okay, and by default, I'm going to have some members here that I can access. I can say dot equals, dot get hashcode, dot get type, dot toString. And these are just the .NET framework's standard members that you can use. And the reason is because I know I haven't talked about inheritance yet, but essentially our custom class inherits from a parent class which has these members. Okay, so what I want to be able to see is my attack method here, but I can't see it. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to demonstrate the value of scope. And as you can see here, I used public for my constructors, and that's why I was able to see my constructors from program.cs. So all I need to do is set my attack method to be public. And when I do that, I can come back to program.cs, and I can say Caveati, because that's the name of my object, dot, and now you see attack showing up because I made it public. Okay, now check this out. If I come back to enemy, anything that I make public is actually going to be visible, not just methods. Anything I make public is going to be visible from program.cs. So I can actually say Caveati.name, and you can see it shows up there. So this is a good technique that I like to share with people, where if you don't know what a class does, so for instance, let's see here. So there's a math class. And if you've never used math class before and you want to know what it does, you can just type math and then dot, and you can see all of the members or all the methods and all the variables that the math class has that you can use. So all of these are public. All right. So that's the short discussion that I have on the dot operator. Okay, so again, we want our Caveati to be able to attack. And to do that, we're just going to say that. Since it's a method, we use our parentheses. Okay, I think that this is going to work for us. So let's go ahead and run. And we should see that console.writeLine appearing every second or so. And there it is. We have Caveati hit you for 5 points of damage. And you can see that approximately it's ticking every second because I have that attack timer variable incrementing and getting reset back to 0 every cycle. Okay. Now what I want to do is, if you remember in the previous tutorial, our classes can instantiate multiple instances of itself, or multiple objects. Okay, and so right now our class is only spawning one object, when in fact we can have as many enemies as we want. And so I'm going to create a new enemy, and I'm going to call it dragon. And to illustrate that this is going to work, because what I want to do is I want to say dragon dot attack. And to illustrate that this is going to work, I want to not use the default constructor. Instead, I want to use my overloaded constructor and pass in a custom name. So I want to pass in a custom name, which is going to be dragon, a custom health, which I'm going to set to 1,000, and a custom damage, which I'll set to 50. And so since I'm using, I instantiated my dragon object, my enemy object, with new variables. These variables are going to be showing up through my attack method. And so what you should see when I run is two different enemies attacking you for different amounts of damage. Okay, so again, this is the health and this is the damage. So we should see dragon hit you for 50 points of damage. All right, so let's go ahead and run this to see if it works. And there we go. So each second we're seeing this happening. Now what I could do is go to my enemy and let's see. I could add another variable to my constructor called double attack speed. So it's going to be our custom attack speed. And what I'll do is I'll set attack speed equal to that. So now what I can do is come back to my program, and you can see that it's not recognizing a default, or it's not recognizing an overloaded constructor with only 3 arguments. So I need to pass a 4th argument, which is going to be our attack speed. And the attack speed I want to use is 2. So every 2 seconds, or I'll even give it a different value, like 2.5. So every 2.5 seconds, we should see the dragon attacking. So let's see if this works. So we should see 2 Cave Yeti attacks before we see our first dragon attack. And there you go. You can see it's working just as we expected it to. And so you can see that these 2 objects are operating totally different from each other. And actually you can see that the Cave Yeti was able to attack 3 times there, which actually that makes sense. Should be able to attack 3 times there as well. Okay. Yes. So this is working just as we would have expected to. Alright guys, that's going to conclude our discussion on classes and objects. In a future tutorial, we are going to be talking about those properties that I was mentioning throughout the tutorial. But you guys, if you were following along and you created your own enemy class, you have definitely overcome a programming milestone for your careers. So congratulations if you got it working. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. But as always, thanks for watching, and this has been a Renaissance Coders tutorial.